Without a doubt, Superman is the most iconic hero of our culture. He is a character who currently represents the greatest virtues and values of humanity. However, for many years he was specifically associated with the United States. An idea that began because of his World War II stories, where basically his comics served as propaganda. Since then, and for many years, the Man of Steel fought for truth, justice, and the American way of life. Fortunately, this idea has changed over the years, and currently in those comics, we're invited to ask ourselves, who is Superman to the rest of the world? That's the premise of the comic Superman the World. An anthology of 15 short self-contained stories where creative teams from 15 different countries develop stories about the Man of Steel. What are these stories about and what's the concept behind this anthology? That's what we're going to talk about in this video. Fortunately, I'm not alone, since I had the chance to talk with the writer and artist Beth, who collaborated on the story set in Mexico. So get ready, because I'm going to take Superman the World very, very seriously. A quick clarification. In this video, I'm not going to give you specific spoilers about the plot of the world. Instead, I'm going to analyze the themes that are presented. Superman the World is the third anthology of this style from Detective Comics, since the company previously did similar projects with Batman and Joker. And, as I mentioned, the central idea is to show how Superman is perceived in different parts of the world.
Each country where there is one where Detective Comics is published, they ask a local team to create a story with the characters set in your country.
And since Batman the World came out, I fell in love with these anthologies. Because it's a very rare opportunity to see the characters in ways you've never seen them before. This is because each creative team knows their country of origin well, and is able to tell a story that mixes a Detective Comics icon with its social and political context, which results in very interesting stories. For example, there's one about Batman taking a vacation and relaxing in Spain, which is drawn in this European comic style. Another thing I really like about these anthologies is that they're perfect for people who are just starting to read comics, since these are stories that unfold in just a few pages and are self-contained. And you don't have to keep up with Detective Comics continuity to understand them. I mean, to understand Superman the World, basically all you need to know is that Superman exists. Because each story gives you the necessary context to enjoy and understand it. For example, there are stories where Clark and Lois are already a couple, but there are also others that are set in a very specific time period. But the story itself tells you that. Such is the case with the story set in Germany, which takes place shortly after World War II, or the story set in India, which takes place at a time when Superman has only been a superhero for a year, and he's still wondering what his place in the world is. And he has to fight against illegal looters. And all these historical elements are also used to tell us about the context of each participating country. Just like other comics from the world, this anthology begins with the story of the United States, who, well, obviously doesn't want to be left behind, right? In the Joker anthology, for example, Jeff Jones and Jason Fabok created a story that works as an epilogue to The Killing Joke and Three Jokers. And here, Dan Jurgens and Lee Wicks present us with a story titled Shoot First, Think Later, where the United States Army is about to bomb an alien giant. Until Superman appears and discovers that the story is more complex than what the army perceives. This story presents Superman as a character who always tries to resolve things. First, through peaceful means, and I think it also works as a political critique of the current situation. Other stories choose to present Superman in a more casual and relaxed environment, like the story from Spain, written and drawn by Jorge Jimenez, where the Man of Steel temporarily loses his powers in Granada and takes the opportunity to get to know the city. The story from France, where Clark and Lois have a romantic date on the banks of the Seine River, or the story from Japan, where we see Superman. Enjoy the local fast food, which is also written like a manga and read in the same way. As you can see, there are many different topics. We'll keep talking about them in a moment. But we also have to take into account that these creative teams had to follow very specific rules set by Detective Comics.
There were two requests. One was that it had to be set in Mexico, and the situation shown could only happen in Mexico. And of course, the obvious one, not to include anything that Superman wouldn't do, meaning not to portray him against his values.
Superman's values. For example, Detective Comics has rules about Superman and alcohol consumption. This cover you see here was extremely controversial, so much so that Detective Comics ordered the destruction of all copies. Didn't you catch the problem? Let's take a closer look. Here we see how Clark and his dad are enjoying a drink together that clearly has the word beer written on it. I mean, it could be root beer, but the problem is a bit bigger, because Clark has his shirt open, so you can see the Superman suit underneath. Which might have made Detective Comics think that this cover somehow links Superman to alcohol consumption. In the end, the unsold copies were supposedly destroyed, and they re-released the cover with this change, specifying that they are drinking sodas. This is something that is also clarified in comics like Superman the World, where it's specified that Clark and Lewis are drinking a mocktail. And in Superman of Space Age, where Clark often goes to a bar but just to drink milk. Although in this comic from the New 52, Superman did make a toast with someone, but only after specifying that he didn't drink alcohol. And there's also another story from the same era where we see Clark lose his powers and get drunk. And we've seen him drink alcohol in other adaptations, so I guess the rules can be broken from time to time. But anyway, let's continue. Another trend in the world anthologies is that the stories tell us about certain specific elements of a country's culture. For example, does the story from Italy have to do with Dante's Inferno? While the one from Brazil tells us about the Tupinambá mantle, a cultural piece made with bird feathers, which was recently returned to Brazil after being in Europe for centuries. I found this story very interesting. Not only because it tells us about a social context through a historical piece, but also because they connect the mantle in a certain way, with Superman's cape as symbolic elements of power and responsibility. Another story that I found very interesting was the one from Argentina by Mauro Mantella and Agustin Alessio, since it brings back concepts like the Scarlet Jungle of Krypton, which appears in the Silver Age comics, and I think it takes inspiration from a very interesting story by Alan Moore from the 80s, where Superman gets a Kryptonian disease and needs Swamp Thing's help to heal. The Argentine story is different, but it reminded me of this comic because of some of the concepts it uses. Meanwhile, the Czech Republic presents us with a story set in the distant future, which talks about very interesting topics like hopelessness and nihilism, and how random fields change according to our perception of life. Finally, there are those stories that bring Superman together with some mythological figure or local folklore character. Among those cases, we have the story from Cameroon, where Superman faces a Pasamoto, in a story that talks to us about the cultural differences that can exist between people, and how Superman, by helping, might accidentally be acting according to a vision of justice that doesn't align with local customs. There's also the story from Poland, where Superman faces Marshana, the Slavic goddess of winter and death. And finally, the story from Mexico, illustrated and written by BV, where the Man of Steel comes face to face with Huitzilopochtli, in a story that emphasizes that both are solar deities, but in different contexts and times. And by this point, I think you've already noticed that several of the entries in this anthology don't follow the traditional style of superhero comic aesthetics. But there's also a reason behind this. Many artists have drawn Superman, each with their own particular style. But despite this, superhero comics tend to follow a specific line, where action poses, muscular and traditionally aesthetic bodies are highlighted, conveying the enormous power of these characters and the drama of their adventures. But comics like Superman the World go for different approaches. Since it's an anthology of short stories that aims to show how different countries perceive Superman, well, it makes sense that some of the approaches are out of the ordinary. That's why there are stories in black and white with accentuated colors and designs more similar to classic Mexican comics, including the onomatopoeias and more experimental versions of showing the Man of Steel. It's not about denying the classic existence, but about showing that Superman can also inhabit other styles and textures depending on the story that's meant to be told. Just as we had already seen through the art of Frank Miller, Darwin Cook, or Frank Wheatley, who have very particular visions of what Superman is.
I even joked in more than one interview many times. I used to say, with the kind of drawing I do, they're never going to give me a job at Detective Comics, and I never really looked for it either. Or at the competition, I don't know, it's not my style, but they accepted me. I mean, I sent in the test, and the people at Detective Comics really liked it. What I think is that they were actually looking for a very diverse sample
of comics from around the world. Personally, one of the things I enjoy most about comics is that it's not just the plot and what you see in the panels that tell you the story, but elements like the type of line work and even the kind of lettering also give us important information for the story. In this case, the idea is that each creative team uses the story and the artwork to present us with their own particular vision of Superman, one that is different from what we usually see.
I actually went for the classic Superman. Now they call it the Bronze Age, like from the 70s and 80s, which is the one I read. He had the peculiarity that he wasn't violent, and that's something I really like. He neutralizes his enemy. He does something so that the supervillain can't be harmful anymore, but he doesn't go and hit him.
And indeed, that's the Superman we see in Beth's story. This version relies more on ingenuity than strength to contain his rivals. Something I always say is that Superman is a very difficult character to write. Not only because he's very powerful, but also because we all have an idea in our minds of who he is. From the most hardcore comic book fan to your aunt, the one who sends skincare memes. And the challenge for this team of creators was precisely that, to tell us for them who Superman is.
That's a really good question. Look, he's the character who started the superhero mythology, and superheroes are, I think that along with jazz, superheroes are like the great cultural contribution of the United States to the world. The idea of superheroes, the concept of the superhero, is a totally North American contribution. Also, it's very, very much in the North American ideology. I started to research very carefully as if into the history of Superman, and I discovered that originally he's like a character in some way from the working class, like that's where he comes from. It even says so in his first appearances, like he's on the side of the oppressed. I think of him as a pop culture god and a benevolent god who could choose evil but decides to do good.
And I think that's the best part of these anthologies, exploring these characters from places that are uncommon.
When I read the first two, what I found fascinating was discovering authors from places that are very hard to reach otherwise. I mean, I think about how there are Turkish authors or authors from the Czech Republic who are very hard to get to know. And the way they contextualize it to their different backgrounds and cultures, I think that's the most interesting part. I want to think that's where the spirit is going.
Collection. And it's through proposals like this that Detective Comics continues to present Superman as a global hero, a symbol of hope that knows no borders and looks beyond the needs of a single country. Because today Superman is still the greatest hero of all, one who fights for truth, justice, and a better tomorrow. That's all for today. I'm Go, and keep looking beyond the obvious.